Welcome back viewers, ladies, gentlemen, non-binaries and anyone with ears or other sound detection organs. Hope you enjoy. We are continuing with Going Native, written by Uncle Sealing. Going Native, Chapter 84. Jelsai was fuming as she stomped out of the room, away from Regional Governess Elinki and her threats. The woman had managed to pull Jelsai fairly far away from the party, and ahead of her she could see the militia gathering, barring entrance to the part of the governess's manor where the event was being held. Keeping her from Stace. "You're old-fashioned, The young Shilvati male held a drink out on a tray in front of her. The comment snapped her out of the spiral of rage that was starting to form. The drink was clearly not an old-fashioned, but that wasn't important. Jelsai scratched at her neck, unclipping the crest of House Chelsa from her cape. As she picked up the long-stemmed glass, she dropped the crest onto the tray. In a single smooth motion, it was gone and the tray was tucked under the server's arm. With little more than a nod, he was gone. "So, yeah, I like him, but I don't know if he even noticed that I exist. And now that Mom made me move here to Earth." Dali Elinki, daughter to the regional governess, let out a quiet sniff. She had opened up quite a bit since she sat down with Stace, and, now that they both had an alcoholic drink and most of the other guests had decided to leave them alone, Stace found himself far more relaxed. "Would you like some advice?" Dali smiled. "If you don't mind. I mean, you're a human, but you're still a guy, right?" "So I've been told." Stace took a sip of his drink, some fruity something. It was good, even if it was so sweet it made his teeth hurt. "Write him a message. Don't confess your feelings right away, you don't want to come on too strong, but you're on Earth. From what I've been told, that in itself is pretty interesting. Ask him how things are going back home, tell him a few tales about how things are here, and—" Stace lost his train of thought. Something was wrong. "Are you okay?" Dali's confidence was shot immediately. His discomfort must be obvious. Stace scanned the crowd, trying to find what it was that bothered him so much. "Are you armed?" "What?" "No." Now Dali seemed properly panicked. "What is it?" "Something's about to happen. All the wait staff are gone." Stace slid his glass out of reach on the edge of the table, placed his hands flat on the composite tabletop. "Easy to see, non-threatening. Keep your hands free and clear so nobody thinks you have a weapon." Dali swallowed, but mirrored his actions. Drink out of easy reach, hands on the table. Then they waited. Dear child-like questing for great truths were generally comfortable being uncomfortable. Being able to turn on and off sensory inputs meant that being stuffed in a confined, sweaty space was only as painful as you wanted it to be. This was a good thing, because the van questing for great truths was in, parked just down the street from the governess's manor, was overstuffed with surveillance gear. She barely had room to maneuver to the small workbench in the back. She placed her prize on the table and got to work. The crest of House Chelsa came apart under deft fingers, revealing a contraption that might have been recognizable to a shill, a few hundred years ago. It had been clear to the gear child that she was going to need to overcome quite a bit of counter-surveillance to get what they needed. There were a few options, from drones with directional microphones to infrared lasers measuring vibrations of windows, but Quest needed something more personal and short-range to really get inside the party. It turned out that Samuel had an answer. Once the small, flirty human had decided that questing for great truths was part of the team, he had given her access to a treasure trove of designs he had made over the years. One of the designs was for something absurd in its simplicity, and Quest had little trouble adapting it for the current application. The springy retaining clip inside the crest popped free with a gentle tug. Quest's silver fingers slipped inside, removing a tiny spool the size of a fingernail. Wound around it was a whisper-thin strip of plastic film impregnated with a fine lattice of magnetic powder. The rest of the crest contained a microphone, essentially just a paper disc, a magnet, and a coil of wire, and a few tiny bits of circuitry. The entire circuit was analog. It couldn't be disrupted by jammers or high-frequency obfuscation because it simply couldn't hear them, it wasn't sensitive enough. Hacking its recording software wasn't an option because it didn't have any software. Quest teased out the start of the ribbon, then ran it through a palm-sized machine of her own design. It read the waveform on the tape at a monstrous speed, consuming the entire spool in a couple of seconds. She slowed her new digital audio file down to real time, ran a speech-to-text algorithm on it, and sent the results to the relevant people. Once it was complete, she finally looked at the transcript herself. Immediately concerned and fearing for her friends, Quest sent a message back to the Painter Research Institute. Then she plugged her cybernetic arm into her full electronic warfare suite. Questing for Great Truth's body went slack, collapsing onto the hard steel floor of the van, but she didn't notice or care. There was work to do. The wind whipped along the landing pad, chilling the air. Commander REM, tasked with protecting the Painter facility and all of its occupants, barely noticed. Her rage was keeping her plenty warm. Next to her, Scout Captain Pellick stood in a sort of easy slouch. Even after working together for months, REM had trouble focusing on Pellick. Every aspect of her body language said, "I'm not important, ignore me." Besides, REM had much bigger problems to draw her attention. The militia shuttle had come down and slammed into the pad at combat drop speeds, the doors blowing open. More than 24 members of the local militia spilled out and demanded that REM turn over all of the humans. She had been in the process of telling the militia that they had no authority here and could shove it up their cunts when, as if on cue, the problem became infinitely worse. The EXO that had stomped out of the shuttle wasn't the newest model or the fanciest, but it was armed and armored for combat. REM wouldn't be able to stop the thing from wrecking the entire facility and killing everyone if they wanted to. The implied threat was all it took to make her stand down. At the militia captain's commands, REM had sent out the orders, her deployed forces at the gate and on patrol were to stand down. Any Marines not on duty were confined to their rooms. Militia troops were already prowling around, doing goddess knew what. At least Dr. Painter, Samuel, and Iing's family were off-planet. Commander REM could take some small solace in the fact that her failure wasn't total. In questing for Great Truth's hotel room, there was a large case. It looked no different from many of the cases she travelled with. In fact, it sat at the top of a pile of similar cases. One would be hard-pressed to see anything unusual about this case, until it started moving. The lid popped open with a hiss, a complex hinge causing the top of the case to fold in on itself and expose the interior. 2 cradles, each containing a folded metal armature, began blinking status lights as they came to life. The first drone lifted from the case with a barely perceptible wobble and began to move towards the window. As it moved, the drone unfolded out of its packed configuration. It was a disc almost half a meter across with 6 turbines built into its perimeter. The top was smooth and matte black, the bottom the same non-reflective coating but studded with the lumps of compact antennas and sensor packages. Centered in the bottom of the disc was a claw. It served as landing gear, but that was the most boring of the claw's capabilities. The second drone came to life just as the first lowered its claw on a small cable. The drone shifted, the claw swung, and it closed on the crank that controlled the hotel room's window. The little ship began to fly in circles, pulling the steel cable taut and forcing the crank to move in jerking starts and stops. The moment there was clearance, the second drone shot through the window gap and into the night. Quest was in the network, she could see through every camera and sensor on base. There were no secrets her mind could not pry apart. The first drone shot through the sky, moving at full speed towards the observatory. The other began gaining height. Antennas began to pick at the various signals transmitting around the base and, like an infestation, questing for great truths began to infiltrate and saturate those signals. She was a being of computation and data, and the electromagnetic spectrum belonged to her. You two figure out who's going first. I'm going to take a piss. The militia woman leaned her rifle against the wall and slipped into the bathroom, closing the door behind her. Jemsai looked across the room at the other two, a pair of large Shilvati with eager looks on their faces. Off to the side lay Toril, motionless since one of these monsters had clubbed her in the face with the butt of a rifle. You can't do this, Jemsai said. He tried to keep his voice calm as he stepped back. What you're about to do will ruin you and your families. Everyone you care about will pay. Nat, the one closest to Jemsai, said. She had already begun to remove her armor, tossing it to the side. We have our orders. You die trying to protect those human terrorists. At least this way we can have a little fun first, right? Fuck. Jemsai felt panic clawing at the edges of his nerve. Keller should be here, but she had been over at the observatory with Elora, picking out something for movie night. This place was supposed to be safe. Breathe, Jemsai. Calm. The fear drained out of him. He could do this. He was the honored son of House Chelza. The meditation and focus exercises his sword instructor taught him seemed to have all prepped him for just this sort of crisis. His hands relaxed, opened in readiness, and he stepped backwards towards the bed. He let dejected acceptance fill his face. Let them think he meant to play along. Let them ignore Toril, and the single finger on her right hand tapping out a noiseless countdown for Jemsai's eyes only. Thick, strong fingers dug into Stace's upper arm. It wasn't quite painful, but it was close. A head came over his shoulder, and from the corner of his eye he could see the shape of a tusk, the purple skin of a Shilvati. Her voice was quiet, but firm. You're coming with us. No. Stace channeled all of his years lecturing to students and giving presentations at school into the one word. He didn't shout, but his voice carried in a resonant baritone that drew immediate attention. Faces turned. Stace heard a few small gasps. I don't want to make a scene, but I will if I have to. The woman's voice was strained and she tried to keep it quiet. It was obvious she didn't want to do this either. You're under arrest. Don't make this harder on yourself. Arrested? On what charges? Again, he made his voice carry. Stace let his eyes wander a little, seeking out the guests. Letting them see the fear on his face. Instead of answering, the woman attempted to pull Stace out of his chair. This did not go as well as she could have hoped. The human let himself go limp. He had loosened his prosthetic to take some of the pressure off while they were sitting down and, in the end, all the militia woman had managed to do was yank him out of his chair and spill him onto the floor. His prosthetic slipped from his pant leg and clattered on the polished tile along with his cane as he flailed out. What is this? Stace looked up and, for just an instant, locked eyes with the woman who had closed the distance. The noblewoman from House Orlan. She gave him a compassionate look before turning her attention to the woman that had just thrown Stace to the ground. Other noblewomen were closing the distance as well. I demand that you explain yourself. The militia woman glanced behind herself at the dozen or so companions backing her up. She seemed to take strength from it, and when she turned back to the nobles she managed to keep her voice from quavering too much. This human is a terrorist. I am taking him into custody. A terrorist. Orlan's voice was so patronizing that Stace had flashbacks. Rich parents who can't believe their little shit did anything wrong. You think this human is a terrorist? Perhaps you are confused. No. I have my orders. And do you have a warrant to go with your orders? I'm calling my legal team. One of the other nobles gave Stace a confident grin as she pulled out a small, delicate-looking pad. We'll find whoever signed off on this and crucify them. Don't bother. The militia parted to make way for Regional Governess Ellen Key. Her bulk bounced as she moved, what she probably thought was a purposeful stride only making her look slightly silly. I'm right here. The soft, puffy fur of Pomme de Terre tickled Eskel's face. In any other situation, he would have found it pleasant. Now, though, he was terrified. The small dog seemed to pick up on it and turned in his arms, wiggling to lick at his face and soothe the panicking Helcom. They were in his apartment, currently being borrowed by Spreads the Word through Noble Service. The Gear Child Surgeon Priest hadn't made any changes, though there was luggage scattered about. Eskel was sitting on the floor behind one of those large cases, legs crossed, hiding from militia officers who seemed to have the run of the place. From his hiding spot, he looked across at Jessica. She locked eyes with him and smiled nervously. Eskel's girlfriend wasn't just hiding, even though she was one of the militia's targets. She raised one finger to her lips and winked. Her other hand casually held Stace's massive revolver. Eskel had been in the medical wing, helping convert their little nursing station into a surgical theatre, when the militia had crashed down and disembarked. Jessica had arrived at the medical center at a dead run, panting from exertion, ready to protect him. Then they had made their demands. Word had followed them into Stace's room, where Eskel showed Jessica the man's weapons. She checked and loaded them with a confidence that was a little unnerving. Eskel hadn't realized that she knew anything about human firearms. Now they were hiding in Eskel's apartment while Jessica listened to Spreads the Word through Noble Service through the door. He was trying to stall the militia, to convince them to leave this area alone. It didn't seem to be going well. Jessica raised the revolver, grasped it in both hands, and pulled back the hammer. The Necessity, first and only spacecraft of the Painter Research Institute, popped back into the Sol system with very little fanfare. Ieng did his post-phase checks, making sure the drive shut down properly and the ship would be ready for normal space movement. Everything seemed to be in good shape on the space truck. Are we there yet? Samuel grinned from the co-pilot's seat. By some unspoken rule, everyone had agreed that Samuel would be Ieng's backup. Whenever he had a free moment, which wasn't often, he was reading the manuals and regulations for spaceflight. Not yet. I just sent a message to System Control. Once we have permission to approach Earth we should be good to go. Think Stace is all Robocopped yet? Sammy was bouncing in one of the jump seats behind the pilot compartment. That surgeon guy should be there by now. Ieng couldn't think of a single way that would end up happening shy of Stace stepping on a landmine. I thought that movie was about how horrible becoming a cyborg would be. Really it was more about how corporate power structures disenfranchise the lower classes. Merin thought about it. But Stace definitely gave off Robocop vibes in that bar video. In the last couple of months, Merin had watched more human films than she ever had in her previous years on Earth. Despite having terrible taste, the Sams loved movies and often a good one managed to sneak through. I'm going to go ahead and send a message to House Chelza. As soon as we're back home, they are going to want to go over the data with us. Samuel nodded to himself, then smiled. Besides, the VCA is a major success. We should gloat a little. End of chapter. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, click the bell so you don't miss any episode and do all the other YouTube stuff, visit and support the author, and I'll see you next time. If you didn't enjoy, comment on what I can do better. And as usual, have a wonderful day.